I'm so excited to have both of these individuals on to talk about the truth about gerrymandering. I'm going to give a little intro about the channel. I'm going to share a little bit about why I kind of decided to start this, and also I'll give our amazing guests an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm Destiny, she, her pronouns, and the channel really sparked from me thinking about how I could elicit change. And I started really thinking about this before we came on as to why. And it really just came from seeing, I was watching YouTube. There was a panel that the Urban League had actually hosted, and Mark Morial, the president, shared that before his mom passed away, she was deeply concerned about the state of the nation. And his words, which were very simple, that his mom shared with him, which was that he needed to do something, just really stuck with me. And so this is me doing something, just trying to make space for people to share, to learn, to grow, to raise awareness, but also to give people language on the things that are really important and what is happening in our communities. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm going to be learning along with you all today. I'm very new to the topic as well. So hopefully you feel that. And then if you have questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat. So I have the YouTube out, so I can see the comments that you all are dropping in the chat on YouTube. So I'm going to turn it over to my guest to do a quick introduction. Tamaya, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. So, my name is Tamaya Dennard, she, her pronouns. I am located in Cincinnati. My day job is Program and Partnerships Manager for Represent Women, where we work on gender parity for women in elected and appointed office. But in my personal capacity, I'm an activist. I'm a former elected official. I used to be president of Cincinnati City Council. And I've always just been concerned with um, leveraging whatever platform I have for underserved folks or folks who have historically been ignored. So it's really cool to be here, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Tamaya. Nick, you can share with the group a little about yourself. Uh-oh, I think he might have got dropped off. Let's see. Oh, there he is. Nick, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can
Yes.
hear you. Yeah, if you could
Okay,
give
cool.
us a quick intro.
Sure. My name is Nicholas Little. I live in the great city of Houston, Texas. I'm very active in the community as far as different organizations and various capacities in the community when it comes to dealing with political activism, combating gerrymandering, combating gentrification. One of my happiest moments I think I had this year is when I went down to the Texas State House in the state senate to testify against redistricting that happened in our communities. So I'm just glad to be actively a part of my community, glad to be able to affect people in a positive way across the country. And I just love being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick. So I want to take a moment to just let folks get to know y'all as people, right? We talk about the work all day, but it's good to know who is Tamaya, the person, who is Nick, the person. So I want to do a quick icebreaker question. What's something that people would be surprised to learn about you? So something fun.
A lot of people wouldn't guess that I was elected prom queen when I graduated from high school.
Okay, what did you wear?
This beautiful black dress that actually my mentor, who was my English teacher, bought for me. But yeah, my persona right now doesn't give prom queen, but I was most definitely voted prom queen.
I love that. So again, we are talking about the topic of gerrymandering, which is a very important topic. But before we get into the details, Tamaya, could you just share with us why is this conversation important? Like, what is it? What is at stake for individuals, for Americans, if we don't know or learn about this?
Sure. I remember learning about gerrymandering actually in civics class. I love social studies, but I remember this specific topic, way back in the 90s when I was in grade school. So I think a lot of people maybe heard it and didn't pay any attention, but gerrymandering is essentially it's the way districts are drawn in this country. And when I say districts, I mean voting districts. So you may live in one section of town, and even you may have a friend or a family member who still is in the same town but in a different neighborhood, and you may have different congressional representation or state representation, or even on the local level, city representation. So it essentially is how districts are drawn, voting districts are drawn in a particular area, whether it be city, state, or community. And I think honestly, I'm sorry, not your second part of your question is what's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
How districts are drawn, a lot of people don't realize how your district is drawn dictates what your political power is in a lot of spaces. So there's an intentional manipulation around how to draw these districts. Typically, what happens is the districts are drawn. They're supposed to be drawn every 10 years in accordance with the census, but because for various reasons they're drawn more frequent. And I think it's been in the news a lot because I don't know if you all remember in 2008 when President Obama was first elected, and a lot of people were super excited, the people about his election. And then in the midterms, the congressional midterms in 2010, so 2 years after he was elected, his words were, "I took a shellacking," meaning that even though he won the presidency, when it came time to vote for Congress people for him to work with, he lost a lot of support from on the congressional level. And what's happening right now in the news is that Trump and his policies are very unpopular, and they know that. So in the midterm elections, because you can't reelect the president, but every 4 years, but there's a way that voters can um, let their voices be heard in the midterms, which is voting for a Congress that's able to counteract his power. Knowing
Mm-hmm.
that he is very unpopular and his policies are unpopular, rather than letting folks vote the way they vote, he has asked the folks in Texas, governor in Texas, to find him 5 new seats, meaning he wants to keep the balance of power uh, favorable to him instead of just letting voters vote. He realizes his administration realizes how unpopular he is. So we'll get into what that means, but yeah. So essentially, gerrymandering is how districts are drawn, and it either it can be used for good, but right now, unfortunately, it's being used for evil.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you said that because that was one of the things that I was also trying to get familiar with is kind of like the history and behind it. And it is true that the maps can be drawn in a way that is fair for voters, but then there are times when they're drawn and they do impact individuals in a way that disparages that political power, as you were talking about earlier. And so I know you do a lot of this work in Cincinnati, just like helping individuals kind of understand the process of things. And so could you just kind of break down step by steps, like how does a map get redrawn? Like what does that process look like so that individuals kind of know what to look out for, what to listen for
Mhm.
as election seasons come up?
So two of the terms that you'll probably hear most as it relates to gerrymander is something called packing and cracking. Those are the things that you'll probably hear the most. And packing is essentially when you take a bunch of folks and you put them in one district, whereas like maybe in reality there should be multiple districts.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll just say maybe you have a historically black community or a Hispanic community, and they should have 2 or 3 representatives at the state level to represent their interests. But because you understand that if that increased representation impacts the long-term legislation for that state, you will pack all of them into one district with one representative. On the opposite side of that, or on the other side of the coin, is cracking, where you'll take folks and you'll dilute. You'll take a bunch of people who should have representation, and you'll put them in different districts so that their collective voices are diluted. So those are the two things, and I specifically said Latina, Hispanic, and Black people because those are the communities that are disproportionately impacted by gerrymandering the most. The goal, while while voting is really important, we also have to keep our eyes on the bigger picture, and I think we just haven't been, conditioned to do so. Last year in Ohio, there was a fair districts amendment on the ballot that would allow districts to be redrawn in Ohio more fairly. A lot of people either didn't know about it, they weren't educated on it, and being that Ohio is such a red state that once the Republican Party, which is in power right? Their job is they see their job as maintaining power. It shouldn't be like that. The job of an elected official should be to empower people regardless of how they vote. But in with the Republican Party trying to condense their power, they came out against fair districting. So the people who were going to vote in their favor also vote against redistricting, and so that measure lost. So the goal should be in a democracy to elevate and give people as much power as humanly possible. But depending on who's in power, they feel like their job is to maintain power. And that's the problem with gerrymandering. And that's why it's being used for evil and not necessarily good right now.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I want Nick to be able to talk about what the impact has been in Texas specifically. So we'll jump back to Texas and what happened recently. But I want to talk about what's happening now in California and some of the language and rhetoric around that. And so, again, Nick will share more about what happened in Texas, but ultimately those maps were passed and changed. And as a result, Governor Newsom shared that he was going to do everything he could to redraw the maps in California. And so recently we've heard this term revenge gerrymandering being used to describe Governor Newsom's efforts. And so based on your opinion, because as you know and I know, DEI and other concepts right now in the media, sometimes the terms and phrases are distorted and used and weaponized in a way that doesn't actually reflect what's happening. When it comes to this revenge gerrymandering language, like what are your thoughts on that, and how should people think about and talk about what's happening in California, or when states do decide to redraw maps to more fairly reflect those of different backgrounds?
I think so what California does, so a lot of states who are overwhelmingly red, like a Texas, with the Republican governor, they're able to redraw districts without much fear of any sort of retribution. So what Governor Newsom did, seeing that he's in California, which is a heavily Democratic state, he's doing something. There's something on the ballot in California called Proposition 50, and what Proposition 50 does, it's basically a move to counteract. If Texas is going to draw 5 more districts, Governor Newsom's stance is, well, we're also going to draw 5 more districts. What I do appreciate about Proposition 50 is that it's only temporary. It's only the districts are from 2026 to 2030, essentially just to kind of combat anything that Trump is trying to do in terms of diluting folks' vote. So that's what Proposition 50 is. A lot of people it's within the rules. It's fighting fire with fire. And I think I appreciate, well, I don't agree with a lot of things that Gavin Newsom says. I appreciate the energy. He's matching the energy. He's taking advantage of the fact that he has a heavily Democratic state. He's taking advantage of that. And I appreciate that, because essentially what that means, and I can't wait for Nicholas to talk about this because of the proximity that he has to this issue. But what also happens it's not just redrawing the districts, but it's how you redraw them, and it's diluting your leadership. So you have people across this country like Jim Clyburn and of South Carolina, Don Baker in North Carolina, Amelia Sykes in Ohio, who are black representatives. They're also drawing the districts to drown out black representation in Congress. So it's not just redrawing the districts. They're also trying to carve out those districts that have been historically represented by black people. And you got to think, black people in general, I think we're only 12% of Congress anyway, and then black women are only 5% of Congress. So the fact that not only are they redrawing the districts, but they're redrawing to cut out black representation is the challenge. And so I appreciate Gavin Newsom's stance in how he's going about counteracting what's happening in Texas. And you can typically only do that when you have a heavily Democratic state and a Democratic governor. That way you don't pass something that so it could be vetoed or anything like that. So I appreciate him recognizing what his advantages are, and essentially like he's just matching their energy. He said, okay, because it wasn't like he was over there like, figuring out how to increase California's power. He only did it to neutralize what's happening in Texas.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And you mentioned Texas. Of course, we're going to talk more about that. You mentioned we talked about California, but also you mentioned Ohio earlier. So I think one of the things that if you could share more about how has this impacted Ohio, and what do folks in that state, what should they be thinking about or considering during this time?
I think one thing I would like people to do is really just educate themselves. I know it's so frustrating. I am there where it's like it's disheartening, but this gerrymandering thing, they've been working on this for a long time, and um, Trump essentially his election gave them the opportunity to do things that they've wanted to do for a long time. This stuff didn't come out of the blue. And what also happened that I failed to mention is that the Supreme Court recently ruled that districts can't be drawn racially. And historically, they have been able to do so because of the underrepresentation I talked about. So, because of that, the Supreme Court making that ruling, or falling that way on the side of representation, that's what makes it extra hard. Here in
Mm-hmm.
Ohio, I'll just give you an example. Something that was really heavily in the academic space and talking about DEI was what we had called SB1, Senate Bill 1, which essentially
Yep.
made diversity and inclusion programs in education spaces, funding. It made it illegal. And so what I remember was early this year, tons of people coming up to the state house, tons of professors and students and organizations coming to testify before their elected officials about how they will be impacted by SB1, whether it be, you know, issues of like ability, disability, race, gender identity. These were all these things that were going to be in limbo because of SB1. And what made me sad is that I saw the energy that people had, but I knew that the folks were going to vote the way they were going to vote anyway because they don't have any fear, because they're not going to lose their seats, and they're not going to lose their seats because of the way the districts are drawn. So I really would love for people to start making the correlation between, like, when you see something about districting, fair districting on the ballot or just on the news, pay attention to it, because ultimately what gerrymandering does is it gives uh, elected officials an ability to not care about, because they're not going to be voted out because maybe their district has been packed so much, whether it be rural or suburban, that there's no fear of not being reelected again. So that's what's, I mean, just in Ohio, those type of things on the line. I think sometimes people aren't able to connect the dots, or they don't think those things are connected. They are very much connected. And I'm saying is in our organization at Represent Women, we are a nonpartisan 501c3, but in my individual capacity, the Republican Party knows these things, right? And so we have to, people who are of the issue of the ink of the thought that, there should be freedoms and diversity and inclusion. You also have to make those connections, because, people say if you're not on the table, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This is a prime example of that. I mean, so a lot of people, at UC, my alma mater, University of Cincinnati, there are no more, the Culture Center is no more. The Culture Center was a great place for us. There, the Women's Center is no more. The LGBTQ Center is no more. All these things that made my academic life wonderful at University of Cincinnati, younger students now can't take advantage of those things. So, and that's because we don't understand the correlation between districting, gerrymandering, and our representation. So there's a lot happening in Ohio. I would take an opportunity to talk about proportional representation or ranked choice voting as ways to combat that as well. And we could talk about that, but we don't have to just sit idly by, but there's things that we can do or think about that kind of help counteract, what's happening in the way of gerrymandering here in Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to you reminded me that one of the things we wanted to touch on was prison gerrymandering as well. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to come back to that, but
Mm-hmm.
before we do, when you're talking about the recent Supreme Court decision, is that the one that happened with the Louisiana maps?
So yes and no. So the one before, what actually opened the floodgates was
Mm-hmm.
the Supreme Court saying that those districts couldn't be drawn by race. And
Mm-hmm.
what happened in Louisiana essentially was, um, in Louisiana there was a small portion of folks who didn't feel represented. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund sued the state on behalf of those folks, and it's before the court right now. But yeah,
Yeah.
they are definitely related. But yeah, that's, I mean, we're literally fighting for representation when we're already underrepresented. So And then the Supreme Court had already, like last month, maybe 2 months ago, I think last month, they had already ruled that you can't draw districts by race, and that's super problematic and obvious. But they said it was essentially a violation of the 14th Amendment, which is like equal protection clause. But we're not equally protected. So it makes me sad and thinking about all the things that folks fought for in the 60s and the 50s. It's literally being torn down piece by piece, all the protections that our folks fought for. And I really hate when people say, I'm not my ancestor. And I get the sentiment behind it, but I wish we were,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they were willing to lay down and die. They had dogs sicked on them. They were willing to do some incredible things for their rights, and not just their rights but ours. And it makes me sad to see those things literally being dismantled before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you saying that. The reason why I asked about the Louisiana case, because I had seen that it was the arguments were being heard before the court, and I'm like, did they make a decision, recently, like today? But no, thank you for that, because I want to know too, like, was that ruling surprising to you? And the only reason why I asked that is because one of the arguments that was going around, and that folks who obviously felt like the Supreme Court, who still feel like the Supreme Court shouldn't dismantle kind of the map that was redrawn in 2024 to increase representation of Black voters in that state, was that just in 2023 the Supreme Court ruled that the maps in Alabama were racist, and that they weren't representative of that state, being they only had one district that was assigned to Alabama, but Alabama is like almost 30% Black. So that's why I was asking, was that ruling surprising to you? Because or ruling will be surprising, right, depending on which decision that they go with. Because what I'm finding, or what I feel like, is the Supreme Court is a little bit inconsistent in how they think about race, and how they feel like race is or isn't important. And I say that because recently they also ruled in the case, it was Noam v. Vasquez, when it came to immigration stops, that race could be considered. But then we also know when it came to Harvard using race as an indicator for admissions, it was seen as, we're beyond that, we're past that, we shouldn't be looking at race, we shouldn't be considering race. And so when you think about the way the Supreme Court has been ruling and how it could possibly rule in that Louisiana congressional map case, what do you think about that? Do you feel like there will be a great outcome? Do you feel like the inconsistency is there? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to be 100% honest and say that I don't have any faith in the Supreme Court. I mean, would I have been surprised 10 years ago? Yes. But right now, no. Because if we think about it, and we always have to think about things in like some sort of context. I remember when Barack Obama was elected and Mitch McConnell said, "I'm going to make him a one-term president." They made it their business to be obstructionist to President Obama, and so in doing so, the Supreme Court that we currently have is by design of the GOP, because they intentionally blocked, I think, two appointments that
Mm-hmm.
Obama
Yep.
had with, and Supreme Court, those are lifetime appointments. Those are not term limited. So he had nominated like Merrick Garland, who served as the Attorney General under Biden, but Obama had appointed him to the Supreme Court, but they blocked his appointment. And so if you remember, like even with like Trump and these recent appointments, there were people who were like, "Oh my God, these people are unqualified," but they voted for him anyway, right? So
Mm-hmm.
with so even with, like, you think about like Hillary Clinton, and even like thinking about Kamala Harris, how people are like, "Oh, I don't like them. They're women. I don't like the way they laugh." All this dumb stuff, like about like not really understanding the big picture. And the big picture
Mm-hmm.
is we have the Supreme Court that honestly, like, not necessarily I feel like the 92% deserve, but we have the Supreme Court this country deserves. And so because they supported a candidate knowing that they were going to make these sort of appointments, and they just bulldozed because they had the majority. They had the majority because of how districts are drawn, which goes back to gerrymandering, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not surprised at how the Supreme Court rules. Honestly, I would be surprised if they uphold. the districts to be drawn, by. I mean, they've already said they wouldn't be drawn by race, but I don't think they're going to vote. I think they're going to rule in favor of the state of Louisiana. I don't have faith that they'll rule on the side of the black vote, and that's because that's what they've shown us. They have. I mean, John Roberts was a chief justice. I blame him. I blame Mitch McConnell. Of course, I blame. Um, Donald Trump. And then even though it's not super related, but even like, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, all these elections have consequences. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people don't really understand the big picture. And it's not just about, sometimes you might not like necessarily like, I had issues with Hillary Clinton. I'm not even gonna lie. I'm not like I didn't. But I didn't love Joe Biden. But when I tell you I would vote for a dead Joe Biden, I would vote for a cat before I voted for Donald Trump. I ain't gonna hold you. You know what I mean? So, like,
Yeah.
I would vote for my backpack that's sitting right next to me before I vote for Donald Trump. Like, because I understand the big picture, and the big picture is we have a Supreme Court that essentially said um, that he can rule without impunity. Like, he has no like he's essentially the president is above the law, and that was specifically for Donald Trump, as we can see he ran so that he didn't have to go to prison. You know what I mean? Like if he'd have lost, with 34 felonies, he would have been in prison. So I don't have a lot of faith in the institution of the Supreme Court. But one of the main tenets of authoritarianism is to create distrust in institutions. So institutions
Mm-hmm.
that we grew up, believing and trusting and feeling good about, those things aren't there anymore. And that's the main tenet. Like, the Department of Justice. I mean, not that I ever loved the Department of Justice. I know Nicholas is works for the federal government, but I don't love the Department of Justice. I have a felony on my record. The feds put me in prison. Like, I don't love the Department of Justice. I don't love, but we have faith in the institution. Like I went to travel this summer, and usually when you're traveling to another country, the first thing you do is look on the CDC, the Center for Disease Control's website. You want to see what kind of vaccinations you need. I didn't even look on their website because I have no faith in the institution as I did 10 years ago. So that is what they've done to this country, and the Supreme Court is one of those institutions where people, we just don't have faith in them. They've shown time and time again that they aren't looking at actual numbers and data and justice. They just are looking at carrying out the mission of the person that's in the White House currently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that I mean, I agree with everything that you shared. Definitely feel like this year has brought on a lot more distrust, a lot more anger, frustration,
Hmm.
confusion.
Hmm.
One of the things that obviously we talk about is like the distrust in the media, and that started well beyond Trump's second term. He kind of
Yep.
advocated for that narrative to be out there. You can't trust the media, you can't trust what you see, and now
Hmm.
there's so much information out there, and you have to triple, quadruple check sources and information
Hmm.
because that is one of the ways that obviously one of the things we talked about previously with DEI, that's kind of how all of that was able to manifest the way it did because a lot of people received a lot of false information, misinformation, not just about diversity and inclusion, but people with disabilities, trans
Hmm.
people,
Yep.
and that began to become the truth, and it was not the case. I mean, for every kind of lie that was put out there by the administration. So
Hmm.
yeah, I agree. Like when that distrust starts to breed, because people don't know who to trust, what to trust, what's real,
Hmm.
what's not, then
Yep.
you get that in the world, in our communities. So I want to jump back to the prison gerrymandering because I know that was something
Hmm.
that you wanted to share, and I think it's important for those who are listening to learn more about. And this might be the first time that they even have exposure to this. So can
Hmm.
you kind of share with us a little bit about what that is, what that looks like, and that impact on communities?
Sure. So there's different variations of gerrymandering, and one that doesn't get the attention that it should. We talk a lot about racial gerrymandering, as we should, but one of the things that we don't talk about as much is prison gerrymandering. Just as a prime example, I live in Cincinnati. I was born and raised in Cincinnati. I'm a resident of Cincinnati, but when I was in prison in West Virginia. I'm not a resident of West Virginia, but that's where my sentence was, where I was serving my sentence. So a lot of times, what happens is they'll count people who are in prison as residents or as citizens, which means that the lines or districts may be drawn based on the population, not necessarily the residents who live there. So they're gaining power, money, representation off of folks who are living inside of these carceral institutions, whether they're citizens or not. And so like a place like Virginia, West Virginia, where I was, or even you think about Ohio, places like Marysville, which is in the middle of nowhere, London, Ohio, the middle of nowhere, they don't have much of a population. So the ability to have these prisons in these rural spaces with being able to count the people who are inside the prisons is a big deal for them. And that is prison gerrymandering, because then they get to count those, especially as it relates to representation, they get to count those as folks, even though they know they don't live there, even though you're not paying taxes there, you are a resident of that particular place. So they're able to capitalize off of incarceration in a way that people don't really talk about. So, especially in these smaller rural towns where a lot of prisons across this country are located.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. I think there's a lot of fear about people speaking out and kind of standing up,
Mm-hmm.
advocating, doing these things at the expense of maybe losing their jobs, losing funding for organizations,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So I guess like what advice or like what would you tell people who might be struggling with just that, just wanting to speak out, wanting to be be there at the forefront of these conversations? And then what does that look like? So you mentioned like earlier, people could go came out in Ohio and shared their stories before SB1 was passed. So like for someone who maybe has no idea what that would even look like maybe give a little bit of a summary of like what they can do and how they can get into those networks.
I think it's a really good question, but I think people are either in some way, shape, or form either watching the news or getting their news from somewhere, and it's really hard to turn on your phone, scroll through your timeline, or look at television and not see what's happening in our communities relative to immigration, um, and how literally people are just getting kidnapped off the street, and that's the only term I have for it. Sometimes these folks are not; they don't look like ICE; they look like Proud Boys to me. So I'm not even sure if these are actually you know, federally mandated agents. I have no idea. So there's a lot of ways that people get involved. Obviously, voting is really important, but showing up for impacted communities, like what organizations are assisting those folks who are, you know, getting kidnapped and taken off the street. Maybe making a donation, maybe volunteering your time, your talent. That's really important. And I think thinking about beyond elections in terms of reform. Like I said a little bit earlier about proportional voting and ranked choice voting. These are different. There's a different voting systems that people can advocate for and inquire about and learn about. I think that one way that everybody can make an impact or is educate yourself. This is a time right now, especially if you're like, if you have some level of privilege, any level of privilege, which we all do, take some time and learn about what's happening in these communities. That's free. You don't have to. Why are community? Why is voting rights being dismantled? Let me do some research on voting rights. Maybe historically you haven't felt a desire to learn about voting rights, but do so now. Like, why is these districts in Texas being gerrymandered so bad? Like, what historically? What are the implications? Like, so take the time out right now. It's a crazy time, but educate yourselves on what's happening. So between education, donating money, donating your time, I think and thinking about voter reform and learning about different systems of voting to counteract gerrymandering. These are all really, really important things that we can do.
Thanks, Tamaya. Nick, can you hear us? We just want
I
to make sure
sure
you're
can.
good. All right, we kept your seat warm. So we just kind of went through a couple of questions regarding gerrymandering, what it looks like, the process and things. Tamaya shared some of her experiences as well. And I just asked her to share a little bit more of like with our audience on what they could do. But we were waiting for you so we could circle back to Texas. So could you share a little bit more about what happened in Texas when it came to the redrawing of those maps, and kind of what was the impact or what is the current impact on those communities?
Okay, so one thing I can really say from personal experience, when I went and testified, particularly before the Senate Redistricting Committee, the Senate Chairman is Senator King, and it was amazing how no matter how many people testified, no matter how many people, testified against, redistricting, that he, no matter what, said that his mandate and main objective was to ensure that there were 5 more Republican congressional seats created. That was his only purpose. So even after I literally testified, Senator Royce West of Dallas and my state senator, Senator Boris Miles, asked him. So after hearing this testimony, hearing the testimony of over 200 something people that are saying they're against this, and you're telling me that all you can do is mandate that this has to be done, and he didn't deny it. He just said my mandate and my objective is to get 5 more congressional Republican seats. And I said it to say, they said it wasn't racist, but it was. I just got to call it what it is. When you look at all the areas in which they cut out and cookie cut and carve and all the other shenanigans that they did, you literally see all these areas that are predominantly black and brown individuals, black and brown people. And whenever Chairman King was asked about this, he said that there was no issue or no basis of race was considered in these maps. First of all, the crazy thing of all, my NAACP state conference president, President Gary Bledsoe, who's also an attorney in Austin, he researched the whole redistricting process and kind of find a person that drew the maps in not just Texas, but half the country. Well, for the Republicans, the guy doesn't even live in Texas. He lives in Virginia. So we got people who don't even live in our own state redrawing maps for partisan reasons to try to make sure that they can maintain some level of power or authoritative power over the next several years by trying to turn a particular areas that have been predominantly Democratic red. So the impact of that is going to be catastrophic because now our districts have been cut up and divided into so many places and so many things to where people that look like us are going to be misrepresented. They're going to shove us in places where they can to try to put us to where even when we vote, that there's not enough of us to vote to have a representative that directly that reflects us and our interests and our qualities of life. And I personally say I don't so much focus on. I'm a Navy veteran. I also work in federal law enforcement, and those two things make me, in so many ways and standards, non-biased when it comes to the American people. I serve all American people, regardless if you're Democrat, Republican, pink, purple, brown, orange. We're Americans. That's all that matters. But unfortunately, this current administration, along with our current governor in Texas, has decided that this is the best time in their best interest to blatantly do things to not only destroy diversity, equity, inclusion at the cultural level, but also destroy it in the voting populace as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we kind of talked a little bit about how I heard some overlap to Maya, like what you were sharing about what happened in Ohio with Senate Bill 1. So, yeah, it sounds like there was clearly, and we know there was clearly an agenda, and the agenda was carried through, even though folks did show up and show out and share. But I think what is important to emphasize is that people did show up, right? And so, like, even though it didn't necessarily work out in Texas, we know that this issue is pervasive and it's going to continue to happen. And the people need to still show up and show out in these other places when it does come up. And I also wanted to have you share with the audience, which you can, your experiences connecting with the Texas Democrats that courageously and famously, they literally went viral for fleeing the state so that they wouldn't have quorum so they could vote on these maps initially. And so what was that like? What can you share with us about that experience? What was their mindset? We know that they were threatened with losing their pay. We know that a lot of folks were threatened of being arrested. And so what can you share about that time and how they were doing?
I know my state representative Ron Reynolds was the first member of the Democratic caucus to say break quorum, and when he did it, of course, many others followed suit. My state representative Jolanda Jones, she stayed a little longer because she was just so bothered by the fact that they were trying to push this agenda forward. And they wanted people just to hop on the bandwagon and say, let's do this. But, in the experiences as I spoke to many of them and experiences they had, some of them had good experiences, some of them had bad. But at the end of the day, they all said that no matter what we experienced, we were all together. They said we were all doing it. We weren't fleeing from our posts. We weren't leaving our posts abandoned. We were doing this because we needed to make sure we had to make sure the people are aware of what's going on. And of course, with the quorum break being so repeatedly talked about, people finally begin to look at it and realize, like, man, what's going on that our state legislators have to break quorum and go flee to other states just for people to understand what's going on. And and they didn't run, it wasn't out of fear. So I don't want anyone to think that they ran out of fear or anything like that, because at the end of the day, when you're in a leadership role, you're subject to anything. You're subject to public opinion. You may be subject to threats. There's all types of things that could come across your desk. But they did it because they were doing it for the people, because they feel like the people's voice was being stomped upon because right now in Texas, our state house and Senate the Republican Party has a majority. And again, I will say this: there are some Republicans who, even though they voted um, opposite, I guess what you would say, are some of the qualities of what the things that would opposite. They voted opposite against what the things that would be helpful to us. Some of them still said they felt bad, and a lot of people, and that's what I think a lot of people are missing. You have a lot of people who may be in the Republican Party who's starting to have a conscience. They're starting to realize, man, even though I'm in a smaller town, I realize this may not be the best thing after all. This may not just hurt people that don't look like me, but this might hurt people that look like me too. And I think at the federal level now, people begin to realize that it's a trickle down effect to everybody. But here in Texas, our legislators were brave. They were consistent. They all when they all came back. Of course, we had one legislator that was locked in the Senate in the House chambers because she refused to sign a slip to be monitored by DPS state troopers when she left the Capitol. Like different things like that. So through it all, they held their ground. There was only so much that they can do because of the way the governing and legislative body is. But they made one thing they did do is bring awareness, and now it's important that we don't just let what they did just fall to the wayside. Now it's time for us to take on the mantle and realize that as the people, we can't all put it on our legislators. Now it's time for us to step up, and we have to take things in our hands too, such as voting and getting more involved and getting more engaged and showing up at the state capitals to make sure that we let them know that we don't work for them; they work for us. And I think we have to keep reminding them that.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
So I wanted to. We got a little bit of background. I'm just gonna mute you, but no worries. You can come on me whenever you're ready to chat. Before we close out, I wanted to circle back to one of the topics that Tamaya and I touched on, which was the current case before the Supreme Court regarding the Louisiana maps that were redrawn in 2024. And so I asked Tamaya, does she have any hope that the Supreme Court will kind of vote favorably in keeping those maps the same, which would allow for Louisiana to have fairer representation of the Black vote in that state? And I wanted to just get your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on what's happening there, and what do you think will happen?
Well, I look at the history of the Voting Rights Act. It was passed by a Texan, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and it's just one of those things where it's just amazing that we are in a day and a time and age where even things like that, the people's right to vote has to be reconsidered in any kind of way. It's amazing that we're having to redraw lines just to fit partisan values or to fit a standard to where only certain people stay in power. I am hopeful that the courts would do. The courts haven't been the best lately, but I'm hopeful that the courts will do their due diligence and ensure that the people's rights are not stood upon, and that people have a right to be able to vote in whatever way they would like to. At the end of the day, if the courts don't support this matter, then I personally feel that our democracy is truly at jeopardy, because all it takes is one court case to begin a domino effect of failures throughout the whole process. So I'm really concerned about this. Because I've been watching it very closely as well. Hoping that again that the courts make the right decision and that people come out. I know I signed. I know in Texas we had a lawsuit going on as well. I signed on as one of the plaintiffs for that lawsuit here in the state of Texas. But it's scary. But at the same time, it gives us the ability to be able to realize that the fight is now. And no matter if you're in Louisiana, no matter if you're in Texas, no matter if you're in Florida, the fight is now. The fight is here. There's no one coming to save us. We have to do it ourselves. And I hope that with things that's going on and things that's going on in the courts, that people are actually watching these things and realize how important it is to stay engaged. And I really do hope that it all works out for the better good of everybody in Louisiana, and also that has a positive effect throughout the nation.
Thank you. I feel like that was such a great overview and rounding out of this whole conversation. So I just want to give you all both an opportunity to share any last words or thoughts on the topic, anything you want to leave our audience with or thinking about as they are transitioning from this conversation and kind of possibly moving into action, or maybe just moving into reflection. Tamaya, I'm going to start with you.
I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation, and I really would love for people to start thinking about other systems of voting. That's something I work on every day. You got to think about the Voting Rights Act. We haven't really been voting that long in this country. My mom was born in 53, and voting has only been around since 65. So I think for us to continue to vote in like the plurality voting, meaning that a winner takes all or one person gets the majority, we really need to start thinking about different voting systems and start exploring that. And I know it's easy to get discouraged. Sometimes I have my days where I'm discouraged, but um, government's ebbs and flows. We've had a democracy that has seeming to be very stable, but I think as we can see now, it's not stable. We don't have some form of democracy. So I'm gonna tell everybody what I tell myself every day is like, keeping myself positive, finding joy where I can find it, and cut off the TV and turn off your notifications sometimes and just go find joy because there is joy out here, and I know it's hard, but fight for that joy, and also rest and joy are part of the resistance.
Absolutely. Nick, anything you want to share?
Yes. So, we live in an era where everything that is so right has become so wrong, and everything that was so wrong is now all of a sudden right. So, these are troubling times. I hate to say it, but we are revisiting some of the same times as our forefathers and our ancestors in the civil rights movement. And, it's scary, but at the same time, we just have to be resilient. We have to be strong. We have to stay engaged. We have to make sure we keep in mind that it does take a village to raise a child. So we need to reach out to our young people because our young people are not really aware of what's going on. They don't realize that the fight we're fighting now is for them tomorrow. So we have to make sure that we engage them and get them to understand how important it is to be at these meetings, be at these town halls, be at your city council, be at your county commissioners, whatever that's going on that affects decision making for you and your community. My grandfather was telling me when I was young that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. I refuse to be on the menu, and I'm tired of seeing my people on the menu too. We're not to be picked over as if we're hors d'oeuvres. We are people with dignity and respect, and I hope that people will understand that this is now our time, better time than any time. This is now our time to stand up for what's right, lock arms with each other, put our divisions behind us, regardless of what they are, and realize that we need to fight and maintain our right to vote. We need to fight and maintain our civil rights, and we need to fight and maintain our civil liberties. And more importantly, that no matter what, we're Americans. Our ancestors built this country on their backs, and the legacy falls to us now to maintain what was established. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you both. This was a great conversation. I'm already thinking about what I want to pick y'all brains about next. Really appreciate y'all commitment to this work, y'all support of me, and also just hopefully you feel supported by me as well. Thank you both so much again. And for those who kind of stayed on and listened, we really appreciate the time and energy that you put to this conversation, and we hope that you leave this conversation and choose to do something. Before we fully wrap, just in the spirit of joy, I'm going to play a quick little game with y'all. It's called Clocked In or Clocked Out. All I want y'all to do is say if someone or a person or a group was clocked in, and y'all can play in the chat, or if they were clocked out. So clocked in is they did that, yes. Clocked out is no, terrible, don't want to see it, don't want to hear it. So I'm going to go easy on y'all. The first one is related to the media that we talked about earlier. So earlier this week, dozens of journalists walked out of a Pentagon press briefing to protest a new media policy that would limit press access and transparency to the public.
I mean,
I
I love that I love
I
that
love
the
it. I love it.
and not letting this administration tell them what they can and can't report on. So I'm clocked in on that. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm clocked in on that as well. The First Amendment, freedom of press. So why in the past we have had these issues, and then again, I understand. I was in the military. I understand the difference between top secret and there's a difference between that and transparency. And right now, the Pentagon is not wanting to cultivate transparency. So I'm definitely clocked in on that one. The press should have a right to certain things because the American public, as taxpayers, should have a right to know certain things.
Thanks. Okay. George Mason University refuses to apologize for their school's continued support of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
I was going to defer to you
I was going
on that.
to
Um,
on
George,
that.
they refuse to comply,
George,
or they are against the.
Oh, they are refusing to apologize for their continued support of DEI.
Oh, clocked in all the way.
Yeah, definitely clocked in.
I know a few organizations that need to follow George Mason's suit, but we're not gonna go there today. And then my last one. Music stars Brandy and Monica have officially kicked off their highly anticipated The Boy Is Mine tour. And then I need to know, are you Team Brandy or are you Team Monica?
Man, okay, so they kicked it off in Cincinnati. I'm sorry, Nicholas. I know you said Houston is the greatest town, but Cincinnati is, and they started the tour here. I love both. They're my childhood, but I am Team Monica 1,000%.
Same, same.
Oh man, I'm Team Brandy. I grew up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm Team Brandy all the way. She got my vote, and I hope she feels better by the way. But yeah, she has my vote.
They both fire, but Monica's got like a little bit of ratchetness that I love. They both fire.
All right. Well, thank y'all. I really appreciate y'all. Have a good night. And then for those who are still listening, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you can get updates on our new episodes. And then again, I'm going to drop a link on the page so that folks who would like to be future guests can also sign up and apply. Thank y'all. Have a great night.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.